Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for our first speaker event of the semester here at the Lytton Center for History and the Public Good. My name is Catherine Michael. I am one of the co-directors of the center, along with Dr. Kyle Livy, who you see on your screen. And in just a moment, Kyle will introduce our fabulous guest speaker for today. But to get us started, we always like to read the Lytton Center's mission, so I will begin with that. The Lytton Center considers ways that the study of the past can help shape the present and future. Our mission is to inspire the Ohlone community to work for the public good through programming focused on access, equity, inclusion, justice, and service. The Lytton Center explores challenges facing our community and the world, past, present, and future, and fosters big ideas that will inspire and transform Ohlone and the larger community for the better. Through training, programming, and capacity building, the Lytton Center empowers students to advocate for a just and equitable world. So once again, we are so excited to have you all here with us today. In this talk, we will first hear from our guest speaker, then we will have a time for question and answer. To submit your questions, please use the Q&A feature that you see on Zoom at the bottom of your screen. I will now hand it over to Dr. Livy to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Michael. It's my thrill and honor to introduce Deb Busman. And before I begin, I want to say that it was our goal this year to bring in the arts to the work that we do here at the Lytton Center. And in the fall, we welcomed Daniel Summerhill to share his work and his poetry and his process. And it's really exciting to bring Deb Busman here in the spring to start us off with our first event in the spring to share her work. Debra Busman is a fiction and creative nonfiction writer and professor of creative writing and social action at California State University, Monterey Bay. She is the author of the novel Like a Woman, co-editor of the award-winning anthology Fire and Ink, an anthology of social action writing, and has contributed chapters to Combined Destinies, Whites Share Grief Around Racism, Challenging Inequalities, Readings in Race, Ethnicity, and Immigration, Street Lit, Representing the Urban Landscape, and Ways of Being in Teaching. It's my thrill to introduce my friend, Debra Busman.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Catherine. I'm super happy to be here. So this is my game plan. I thought what I would do is talk about social action writing kind of as a genre and practice, and then talk some of its key elements, its craft elements, some of the key attributes that you see in social action writing, and then maybe share a little bit about the creative writing and social action program that I teach at Cal State Monterey Bay, and then share some of my work. So that's the game plan, and then we'll break for Q&A. So as we go, anything that pops up, any questions you have, any things you want to know more about, because I could talk about any of these things for hours, go ahead and throw them in the chat. You can ask me anything. So the creative writing, social action, like social action writing, it's been recently named, but it's a longstanding practice. So it's kind of like the literary version of Howard Zinn, right? And People's History of the United States. It's like reframing the narrative, centering whose voices are heard, right? Whose voices we hear about and whose are left out. So it's grounded like in the questioning of who has the power, right? Who has the power and the privilege to control the narrative? So whose stories are being told, who's left out, silenced? Because we know that language is power, right? So whether we're talking about the narrations of history or of literature, we have to look at who has the power to write the history and tell the stories. So it's like that proverb, until the lion learns to write, every story will glorify the hunter, right? So I always tell my students, be the lion, be the lion. So when we published our book Fire and Ink, it's an anthology of social action writing. So we put that in the name. And we wanted to do that consciously just to claim the space. Because, like I say, social action writing has been around. People have been doing it forever. But to name it as literary genre felt like something that really mattered to us, that we wanted to do. And from everything we've heard from folks, there's a lot of gratitude about that. So I can talk more about that. So some of the key things you'll hear me talk about around social action writing: bearing witness, right? So bearing witness to social injustice, bearing witness to what is going on around us, not just to what is happening to us personally, but what is happening in the world around us. Breaking silence, right? Looking at whose voices have been silenced, what we as writers, as humans, are keeping silent. What do we share? What do we not share? What are those choices, right? Are we making those choices out of power and strategy, or are we making them out of fear, right? To stay silent. And then speaking truth, right? So, which involves like definitely breaking silence, but also countering the lies that have been told about us by others, right? So, I'm thinking of Gloria Anzaldua's great essay, Speaking in Tongues, right? And that was a letter to third world women. So that was actually the piece that she wrote, sending out, requesting submissions for women of color in particular to submit their work to an anthology that she was editing called This Bridge Called Our Backs, right? So now we all, we know what we've taught it. It's a work, but she had to reach out and grab those folks. And so in that piece, it starts out as an essay, right? But then she breaks into almost more a letter form because it feels like it needed to be more personal. So she talks about her own experience also. And she says, who am I, a poor chicanita from the sticks, to think that I could write? How dare I even considered being a writer as I stooped over the tomato fields, bending under the hot sun, hands broadened and calloused, not fit to hold the quill, numbed into an animal stupor by the heat. But then she goes on to say, I write to record what others have erased when I speak, to rewrite the stories others have miswritten about me and about you, right? So that's classic social action. That's just classic. Going back, I think like James Baldwin, Langston Hughes. So Langston Hughes, 1947, right? He's got his essay that he published called My Adventures as a Social Poet. And he writes, poets who write mostly about love, roses, and moonlight, sunsets and snow, must lead a very quiet life. I imagine their poetry does not get them into difficulties. Unfortunately, having been born poor and colored in Missouri, I was stuck in the mud from the beginning, try as I might to float off into the clouds. Poverty and Jim Crow would grab me by the heels, and right on earth I would land. Right. So for many writers, social action writers was just a necessity. It was, of course, that's what we're doing. Nina Simone said, the artist's duty is to reflect the time, right? So some of the folks that speak out against silence, like I'm thinking of Audre Lorde's beautiful essay, The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action, right? Where she says, my silence did not protect me, and your silence will not protect you, right? So bearing witness, Henry Louis Gates has an entire book called Bearing Witness, in which he looks at African-American writing in particular, and the literature, how, he questions like, why is it that for so many Black writers in America, their first piece published is autobiographical? right? And what is it that is so critical about naming voice? So he says, the will to power is the will to write. And he says, through autobiography, these writers could at once shape a public self and language and protest the degradation of their ethnic group by the multiple forms of American racism. All right. So that's, so he's talking about how writers bear witness. Judith McDaniel, another social action writer, contemporary, she wrote, witnessing is especially necessary when the reality of a lived experience is denied by the culture at large, the culture to which the witness is brought. So, and I got to call out Carolyn Forche because she wrote, I think it was in 1993, right? Her groundbreaking book, Against Forgetting 20th Century Poetry of Witness. All right. So she's claiming that poetry of witness is a genre. And then she follows it like 2014, somewhere around there, with Poetry of Witness, the tradition in English, 1500 to 2001, right? So taking it obviously beyond the confines of our border. So that's what social action kind of looks like in the world. So at CSU Monterey Bay, we actually have our entire creative writing program is named Creative Writing and Social Action. And that was a very conscious decision 29 years ago by the founding faculty who said, we want to do it differently. We don't want to be like every other creative writing program. So it was then, and I believe it still is, the only one in the nation that has that explicit focus. So one of the things that we do there, it's housed like in an interdisciplinary unit, right? So students that are getting their degree, their concentration in creative writing, they're also taking ethnic studies courses. They're also taking history courses. They're taking Kyle Social Impact of the Mass Media course. They're taking all kinds of courses that fuel and feed the knowledge and information that goes into social action writing. So, of course, when you do that, one of the things we talk about, breaking silence, speaking truth, right? And it all sounds really good, but then as a writer, you're put into a creative writing class and you're asked to bring it. You're asked to just be who you are and bring all of you to class, right? Don't just leave it behind, which is kind of what happens a lot, like especially with first gen students, right? That there's a tendency to think like, okay, I got to leave like my home language behind. I got to leave my culture. I got to come here and be a college student. And, in creative writing, it's like, no, you have to bring that, bring it all with you to the class, be who you are, speak truth, right? And so but then they do, right? So I'm going to read a piece from Fire and Ink, which is called "You Gotta Be Ready." You got to be ready for some serious truth to be spoken. When you ask students to break silence, to bear witness, to connect the meaning of their own personal lives within the larger societal frame, you got to be ready for the truths that fly out, crawl out, peep out, scream out from underneath the thick walls of practiced silence. You got to be ready for stories of border crossings, coyotes and cops, night beatings, wife beatings, date rapes, daddy rapes, gunshots and chemo, pesticides, cancer, HIV, protease inhibitors, and the pink-cheeked 19-year-old who says, hey, next Tuesday, I'll have 5 years clean and sober. Can we have a cake in class? You got to be ready for stories that start out, ese pinche Columbus didn't have no stinking green card. You got to be ready for the straight A student who has to leave school because her INS paperwork has not come through yet. The social security number she gave at registration was the first 9 numbers that came to her mind, and she cannot get financial aid because she is, quote, illegal. To teach creative writing means you've got to hold these stories, but you got to be ready for these stories to share classroom space with the one by the retired prison guard, now minister, and college student, who writes of his experience as a young African-American police officer on the scene with 5 white sheriffs in 1960s rural Mississippi, when a 17-year-old gas station robbery suspect, a young man whose family he knew, was thrown into the back of a squad car, handcuffed, locked inside with a 120-pound German Shepherd police dog that was ordered to attack. Then, when the writer describes the ensuing screams, the beer bellies, spit and cigars, the white laughter, the blood, the horrific carnage told 40 years later with such immediacy and precision, you can only hold your heart and say, oh, good Lord, why did I ever stress the importance of using sensory detail, concrete language, and vivid imagery? So there's more. There's a whole, I'll just read an excerpt of it because I just wanted to kind of convey what happens, right? When students really do take you at your word and they bring forth the truth of their lives, because oftentimes it's always a transformative experience, but oftentimes there's a collision of stories, right? Because we all come into whatever sphere we come into with like a combination of knowledge and lived experience and ignorance, right? So there's a lot of learning that also happens. So I could talk about that teaching for the rest of the hour, but I want to jump onto some other things. So I want to read a piece that I recently was published in Cocoon magazine, and is called That Time of Month in America. And one of the things that social action writers do, right, is like consciously position yourself in the world. So what is happening with you embodied? What is happening with you emotionally? What is happening with you in your reality? And how does that interplay with what's going on in the world, right? So, because we're all always located, right, within larger cultural, political, social constructs. So this was a piece that I wrote, like literally it was on the 4th of July, 2022. So it was days after the Supreme Court had overturned Roe v. Wade and women's reproductive rights were lost, right? So this is a piece that I wrote in response, and you'll see that there was also a response from my body. Okay, here it goes. That time of month in America. I'm 68 years old and I'm bleeding. Not bleeding like Jaylon Walker, shot 60 times by police in Ohio last week. Not bleeding like the 30+ people killed or wounded in the 4th of July, rah, rah, America, land of the free parade in Illinois. Not bleeding like the elementary school kids and teachers in Uvalde, Texas last month, or the victims of the 300+ other mass shootings in this country just this year. No, I'm not Ukrainian soldier bleeding or Palestinian rock and hand bleeding or back alley abortion bleeding. I'm not gay bashed bleeding, trans bashed bleeding, line all the homosexuals up in a row and shoot them in the back of the head bleeding. I'm not even California Lovers Point shark bite bleeding, or a fall off your bike, or accidentally cut yourself making potato salad bleeding. Nah, I'm just good old lady business on the rag. It's that time of month kind of bleeding, which millions of uterus bearing folks all over the world do on the regular, which I used to do on the regular, which is totally normal, except I'm 68 freaking years old and Aunt Flo hasn't come around for more than 20 years. So what the hell is happening anyway? Why am I sitting on the toilet now gushing blood, bright red blood, dark clotty blood? This is not a metaphor. I'm too old for this shit blood. And of course, I don't have any gear, because who keeps that shit in their house anyway when you haven't bled for, have I mentioned, over 20 years? But I do have plenty of gauze and bandages in the bathroom cabinet and some 2-sided carpet tape in my toolbox. So I jerry-rig some pads together and make do, which is kind of funny because when I was a kid, the neighbor boys and I used to sneak in to steal our mom's sanitary pads and tampons when we got regular kid hurt. Because we discovered that strapped on with just a little bit of duct tape, they stopped the bleeding like nothing else. Until one day when Jack, who was the oldest boy, said, "Stop that shit, that's nasty." But now I'm old and I'm bleeding and there are no pads in the house, and I'm more than a little freaked out because I've never heard of this happening. And damn, are these cramps? Fuck, I haven't had cramps forever. How the hell do people live with the shit every freaking month and go on about our day? No wonder men are so afraid of our power. Who else can bleed without dying, create other humans inside their body, and then feed those newly birthed beings with milk from our bodies? But I am not feeling particularly powerful. And once I get myself all MacGyvered up with my jerry-rig pads, I do what I know better than to do, which is to go online and Google post-menopausal bleeding, which is really a stupid idea because who the hell wants to panic stress about endometrial cancer when the likelihood is that this is all about my sweet naturopathic doctor recently tweaking my bioidentical hormones. But now, since I'm online, I see they have a suspect in the parade shooting, and I know he must be white because they are not mentioning race or terrorism. And yep, sure he is, because wow, they just took him into custody without incident, all alive and not bleeding, not shot 60 times like Jaylon Walker. And oh, look, what a surprise. Now they're showing a photo of the white boy suspect at a Trump rally and reports of him casing out a synagogue back in April. I wonder if the cops will stop by Burger King and grab him a snack like they did with Dylan Roof after he murdered 9 Black churchgoers in Charleston. For sure, they're not going to put him handcuffed, no seatbelt in the back of an empty police van, then slam on the brakes, giving him a rough ride like they did to Randy Cox last month, leaving him in intensive care, now paralyzed from the neck down. And what is it about insecure guys and their penis guns and creepy rage anyway? And how weird is it that I am menstruating or whatever the hell this is, days after the sexual predator-infested Supreme Court overturns our Roe v. Wade, like some strange sort of social, psychic, historical time warp bleed through as reproductive rights are once more under siege, and a 10-year-old child rape victim gets denied medical care in Ohio. Women are now referred to as vessels, and there is talk of using pregnancy-sniffing dogs at airports and train stations to prevent women from crossing state lines. And now, as I change into my third MacGyvered pad, I think about the 10-year-old girl in Ohio, and I think about young Mia Cirillo, the 11-year-old survivor of the Uvalde school shootings, who covered herself in her friend's blood and played dead so that the shooter wouldn't kill her too. I think about her testimony before Congress last month and how it has horrified and haunted me ever since. And not just regular horrified for the obvious reasons, but deep cell body memory horrified because her story reminds me of me. It reminds me of the other damn story I've been trying to write all month, the piece about race, privilege, police violence, about triggered surface memories of sexual assault, the story that made me start to cry when I tried to read part of it out loud to my workshop group last week. Because I was once that terrified girl, and covering myself with blood was what I did too. Except that it was not my friend's blood that I smeared all over myself for survival in that filthy Iowa jail cell half a century ago. It was my own blood. And not just the cut over my eye from the boot to the face blood, but also my 16-year-old girl, terrified menstrual blood. As those men assaulted me that day, ultimately, it was not my kicking, spitting, screaming, biting, yelling, and screaming, and physical fighting that saved me from being raped. It was my blood, my menstrual blood, and my madness smeared all over my crazed face and chest that frightened them off as I crouched back into a corner, snarling. And it was not some right-wing boy man incel with an AR-15 that was the threat that day. It was the police that I needed to be rescued from and wasn't. The police who held the guns, the rage, the hatred and fear of all things female, or not female enough, or black or brown, trans female, or female like me, cis, butch, and white. Because sometimes even whiteness is not enough to protect and serve when cops decide that all that dyke bitch needs is a good fuck. It's that time of month and America is bleeding and bloodying. And Jaylon Walker is dead. Amare Lage is dead. Tatiana LaBelle, Paloma Vasquez Duval, Princess, dead. And in these times of intersectional bloodbath, rough rides, and legislative assaults, pregnancy sniffing dogs, and protective Proud Boy Klansmen in khakis and white gaiters, exactly who and what is being served and protected, and what ancestral wisdoms and visionary tactics, individual and collective, ancient and future, shall now be forged into resistance. So that's intense. That's the first time I've read that piece. That's I'm gonna need to do some therapy pretty soon, I think. But you can see in that piece, right? It's like centering like what is going on literally like in my body, what is my own personal trauma and tragedy, and how everything else bleeds through into it, right? So I have no doubt that, I don't know how the shit works, but I have no doubt that like the whole Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision bled through into my body and my stress, and then just everything that's going on in the world about everybody that's being hurt, everybody that's being bloodied, right? So it all kind of blends through. So that's an intense piece. I wanted to shift a little bit and read from some things from Like a Woman. So Like a Woman is my novel, and you can see from the cover it is obviously set in LA. You see the Hollywood sign and the little police helicopter, so that tells us where it is. And it's a story about queer kids forging resistance and survival on the streets of LA, homeless. So one of the things that I had to think about as I was putting this book together was, okay, that's the story I want to tell, right? I want to talk about the humanity, the resilience, the brilliance of kids on the street. And it's centered around the main protagonist, who's a lesbian named Taylor, a young girl. So I could start like on the streets. That would be an okay place to start. But it felt important to go back into childhood, right? Both for her character, my character personally, but also just because a lot of times when queer kids are talked about, they're talked about like at-risk youth, or teen pregnancy, or they're talked about like some sort of maladaptive unit that just appeared on the streets. But the truth is that we all have histories, right? We all come from places, and there's worlds of reasons in terms of how folks wound up on the streets, and a lot of them have to do with sexual abuse. But so I'm going to read a few pieces. The other thing about this book is that it kind of breaks all kinds of rules around craft, right? Normally you pick a point of view. You decide that you're going to tell the story in traditional third person narration or first person, right? And then you kind of stay with it. Like those are the unspoken rules. But what happened with this book is I started to try and write it like in third person, but it all broke out. It just, the characters took over. The child wanted to tell her story. The teenager on the streets wanted to tell her story. So it starts out third person, but then it just busts all over the place. So I'll read you a piece, just an excerpt from one of the early stories in Taylor's life. And here she's living at home. She's a 9-year-old. And when I was looking at this book, I was realizing like how many of these stories have to do with work. So this girl's been working a while. But this is a piece called Like the Wind. Taylor's favorite job was stealing from Sears, working for her best friend Mario's uncle Enrique. Enrique had hated Sears ever since he'd gotten fired for pointing out to management that the tan, blonde workers seemed to be having way too much fun, while the brown workers got all the crap jobs and early pink slips. So Sears was the usual target of choice, although Pep Boys and Montgomery Wards were also fair game. Taylor stole bicycles, clothes, electronics, tools, watches, anything she could grab and ride or run away with. She and Mario had figured out pretty quick that as a 9-year-old white girl, Taylor wasn't followed around by security cops like her Mexican friends. So the kids would all separate before entering a store. Mario, Jesus, and Ricky going in one door, and Taylor in the other. Her hair combed and her pink blouse clean and pressed. Once inside, Jesus and Mario would start a fight, or Ricky would get lost and cry for his mama, or they would accidentally knock down the 5-foot-high pyramid of Valvoline motor oil cans. Once personnel went running to investigate the commotion, Taylor stuffed something in her jacket, or when she was lucky, just hopped on a 10-speed or Stingray bike and just rode right out the door. Like the wind, Enrique would say. That girl rides like the motherfucking wind. All she had to do was ride down the street until she saw Enrique's white van. If all was clear, he'd open the back and throw Taylor and the bike inside. If someone was after her, Enrique left the van door shut, looked away, and Taylor knew to keep on riding, ditch the bike, and start hopping fences. They never once got caught, although Taylor hopped a lot of fences. Once inside the van, she and Enrique circled around to the other side of the shopping center to pick up Mario, Jesus, and Ricky down by the gas station, usually the Union 76, because Ricky liked those little orange balls they gave away. The boys would all pile in and brag about what they'd done to attract security, and everyone would laugh. Taylor would tell them how she got away, and then Enrique would say, damn, you guys done good, and tousle their hair. Then he'd light up a reefer for him and Mario to smoke. Sometimes Taylor took a hit too. Taylor had that job until she turned 13 and Enrique got drafted. 4 years, never called in sick, never missed a day of work. And Enrique was an excellent boss. He taught Taylor things that would serve her throughout her life. Like never act like you're stealing when you're stealing. Act like you already own it, like it somehow got misplaced on the shelf by mistake. Ride that motherfucking bike like it's yours, girl, he would tell Taylor, not like you're stealing it from no goddamn pussy Sears store. Even as Taylor got older, Enrique was still right there and with helpful advice. Look like you belong, he would tell her when she started stealing from the department stores downtown. Look like you belong, especially if you don't. When her clothes got too shabby, he warned her, Niña, te acuerdas, only the rich can afford to dress poor. In fact, it was Enrique's idea to start selling raggedy jeans to the hippies out in Griffith Park. Taylor and Mario collected worn-out Levi's and work shirts from all the neighbors, pulling them from the hands of the mothers who first wanted to sew up the tears in their sons, brothers, husbands' clothes. No, Mama, Mario would say, that's the whole point. You don't gotta sew this shit anymore. Taylor's gonna go sell them to the hippies. They pay more money if the pants are torn. I know it's crazy, Mama, but it's true. Give them to me. You'll see. Every Saturday, Taylor and Mario took the bus down to Griffith Park to sell the raggedy clothes to the hippies at their love-ins and anti-war rallies. Every weekend, they brought home more money. And every Monday, the women in the neighborhood went out to Sears to buy new jeans for their kids, new work shirts for their husbands. Sometimes Taylor got to see Enrique in action himself. Once, when his grandmother needed a new refrigerator, he brought home a brand new Westinghouse double door chrome handle with deluxe ice maker. First, he stole a pair of overalls from Sears that looked just like the guys that wore them at the Montgomery Ward's warehouse. Then he sewed on a name tag. Frankie, he laughed. Es un buen nombre, no? Taylor watched Enrique check out the appliance section of the Van Nuys wards a couple of times. And then, damn, if he didn't walk straight into the store and come out the back a few minutes later, wheeling a huge, shiny refrigerator on a bright red dolly. Stole the dolly, too. So that's a sense of, point of view, kind of a traditional point of view. But it's also, one of the things for social action writers is if you're gonna write about race or you're gonna write about stuff that you as an author know, like you as a writer, you may have studied Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality and institutionalized racism and white privilege, which is great. And you can definitely use all that to inform your stories, but you've got to put it in a way that your character knows, right? So how would a child navigate that territory? Which is not that hard to do because, kids know stuff. Kids definitely see race. They don't even pretend they don't. And it was no secret that as a white girl, Taylor didn't get followed the same way, right? So there already was a little form of white privilege going on there for this 9-year-old girl, also gendered, right? The boys were targeted more as criminal, right, than the white girl was. So they just used that to their advantage. So that was that piece. So the other thing, I think what I'll do, I think maybe I'll read some of the pieces. So I've already said that we broke all the rules going from point of view, first person, third person. There's even a second person point of view in here. But there's also mixed in with the stories, there's these little like poems, poetic interstices. I learned that word after I did it, interstices. So they're spaces in between the stories. And so I'll just read a couple of them. They're super short. So this one is called As a Child, I Believed. As a child, I believed we came from wolves, somehow lost, separated inside the city's mass. The children, that is. I had no idea where adults came from, but I thought that children were all adopted, picked out like puppies from the pound. Some got good homes with lots of food and room to play. Some could only cower at the boot, snarl, or run away to try again. My home was not particularly good, except that it was filled with other strays. The pain came mostly in the night, and there was enough to eat. So these little italicized pieces kind of separate some of the other stories. And that one is actually, that one's super autobiographical. That one is, I really did believe that as a kid. I really did think that, that like kids and puppies and, strays, I thought we were all related and that adults were some other species. So I just about left the planet when I found out otherwise. It was a challenge. So let's see, maybe I'll do, let me think. Oh, I know what I'll do. I'll do smoke. So this one, so the other thing, craft-wise that writers have to do, right, is locate their story in time and place, right? So scene and setting. So this is a piece called Smoke. And if you're gonna talk about LA, you're gonna talk about smog, right? You're going to talk about filthy air, especially, this is set in the 60s and 70s, right? So you got to talk about that. And also you'll see in here, back in that day, all the adults smoked, right? There wasn't any no smoking here. So kids were kind of trapped. So this is a piece called Smoke. Tender lungs, sweet pink branches laced with grief, sticky tar, sucking misery. Backhand, secondhand smoke, death's breath everywhere the young girl turns, surrounded by smoke, smoke in the womb, smoke in the ward, smoke in the crib, smoke in the everyday kitchen, bedroom, bathroom, living room battles. Mom smoking Pall Mall unfiltered, mom's boyfriend, his Benson and Hedges. Grandma loves her Winstons. Uncle won't smoke anything but Camels. Mario wraps packs of Marlboro up tight into the sleeve of his bright white t-shirt, tucked smooth into his fresh pressed jeans like a James Dean wannabe. The girls smoke, the pros smoke, the pimps smoke, the Johns smoke, the pigs smoke, the factory smoke. Everyone is smoking, lighting up sorrow. LA is burning, and the trees, tender and valiant as children, trapped in concrete circles, surrounded by a smog-filled sky, browner than the earth. The trees are getting tired. The girl does not smoke, but still she cannot breathe, surrounded. 4 adults, 1 child in a car, windows up, breaking down, chain smoking, trapped. Smoke at the liquor store, grocery store, laundromat. Smoke in every public and private space. The girl watches the cigarette burn low, dangling from her mom's drunken hand, ready to catch the ash or the mother, whichever falls first. Trapped, quiet, barely breathing, the girl watches her uncle across the table, past the meatloaf, mashed potatoes, limp green bean casserole, smoking. He leans back in his chair, takes a long, slow draw, Hollywood style, watching her as he exhales. Her older cousin shifts, says, "May I please be excused?" Gets up to clear the dishes. The uncle's gaze stays on the girl, and she knows she will be next. Tender, long, sweet pink branches laced with sticky tar, death's stale breath everywhere she turns, surrounded by smoke. The girl hungers for air, dreams of the sky, longs for sweet, rough bark, just one pine cleansed breath. Breaking free, she climbs out of the smoky rooms, jumps into the street below, takes in giant gulps of gray, brown LA air, smog so thick the flies don't even bother coming around. Level 9 alert, warning, stay inside, curtail all physical activity, PE cancels, classes canceled, sports events canceled, but never do they cancel the smoke, the exhaustion. Never do they cancel the belt, the bottle, the pigs, the perps, the stinking, sweaty sheets, all the things a child has to run from each and every gray and sticky day. So yeah, so that one is definitely sets us in time and space, right? Because those were a different reality, and those folks that came up in those days, what it's like to be completely surrounded by smoking adults. Let's see how we're doing time wise. Okay, I'm going to read just a couple more pieces. One of the things when you think about breaking silence, one of the things that women in particular, but also young men, keep silent is sexual abuse, right? And one of the things that silence does is it makes you feel like you're the only one that happened to, right? And so there's not only the assault and the abuse, but there's a sense that you're alone in it, right? So as long as everybody stays silent, there's like so many people suffering, thinking that it was something they did or that it was just about them. So that's a thing that you've seen a lot of women breaking silence about, and increasingly a lot of young men breaking silence about, is that particular kind of abuse. So it felt important to talk about that in this book, both for the character Taylor's perspective, but also just because it is so pervasive and so many kids living on the streets right now, so many queer kids, have been abused in that way. So it felt like it was an important story to tell. So I'm going to read a piece about that. And it also ties in, it was interesting, it ties into the trees. So throughout this book, the character Taylor is just really connected to trees. Trees are her friends, to say the least. So this is a piece called When I Was a Little Girl. When I was a little girl, I had a favorite tree. I'd run across the city streets to the park where she grew tall, and with determined fingers and stubby little toes, I'd find familiar holds and climb up to the top. Spiraling up her lovely roughened trunk, limbs reaching out for limbs, I knew she reached for me too. I'd press my cheek warm into her bark, tuck my sleepy body into her waiting arms, and sometimes I would doze, safe and held by strong pine branches, cradled, rocked by western winds. What could be wrong with a picture such as this? What's wrong with this picture is that it is 3 o'clock in the morning. The Santa Ana winds are blowing and the child is all alone 50 feet in the air. What's wrong is that it is 3 o'clock in the LA morning. The child is 5, 6, 7, 8 years old and so afraid she does not even feel her fear. Besides, she cannot cry because just below in the soiled city park, the chain boys gather to fight and fuck whatever comes their way. What's wrong with this picture is that this is one of the lucky nights when the child has won sleep's slow motion race and beat the footsteps coming down the hall. Tumbling out her bedroom window into the streets below, what's wrong is that it is 3 o'clock in the morning. The child is all alone, 50 feet in the air, so afraid she does not even know it. And this is one of the lucky nights when she does not have to look down from the corner of the yellowed ceiling and watch what happens to that strangely damp and quiet girl lying in her bed below. So this was a piece, this was like a super early piece. This was written way before I even thought of putting a book together. And so I'll tell a little story about this piece. It was written, I had not even gone to college yet. I didn't even go to college until I was almost 40. So there's a lot of history before that. And I had barely finished middle school. So I was not a good student. I was not in AP English classes. I failed most of my English classes. So yeah, that was me. But I read a lot. And so what happened with this piece was I had started writing poems actually in therapy, dealing with some early trauma. And I didn't know they were poems. I didn't know what to call them. I just was writing weird stuff that came out of me, and that was the form it came. And so over time, I was lucky to work with a very gifted therapist. And over time, she said, not only are these poems like really good in terms of your healing process, they're really good poems. And I was like, yeah. She goes, no, you're a really good writer. So that was the first time anybody ever named me as a writer. And then she asked permission. Then she took them to a fancy poet, and the poet gave me affirmation. Yes, these are good poems. So they encouraged me to go to this poetry retreat. It was a creative writing retreat called Flight of the Mind, which was just beautiful, set up in Oregon. just in beautiful mountains with the Mackenzie River flowing by. And, you had your own private room and they fed you, and you went to workshops with other writers, and then you went back and sat by the river and wrote. It just sounded like some dream, right? So I did it, right? But what I realized was that there's this whole world called poetry workshops, and there's these whole people that consider themselves poets that I call the capital P poets, right? That really take themselves seriously as poets. And so we were in a workshop, and one of our first assignments was to write a poem about childhood and about something important, especially connecting to the natural world, something important. So I'm like, I know what I'm going to write about. I'm going to write about the tree, right? So I wrote this poem, and then we all come together to workshop. And one of the things about workshopping is when the person shares their piece, you have to be quiet and other people talk about it, right? So you have to just sit there and listen to other people talk about your piece. So I read the poem, and a number of other, it was I think it was all women in this group, 13 people. A number of women were visibly moved and had obviously had trauma themselves, and got what it was about, and thanked me, so there was some positive stuff. But then it shifted to the capital P poets, right? And we were all on the lawn, right? We're all crashed out on the lawn and everything. But the poets were sitting in their little plastic lawn chairs with their pen and paper and everything. So they started their critique. And they said, the poem has potential. It's a really good start. It has potential, but you're going to have to reach for a fresher metaphor. And I'm like, okay, I don't know what that means, right? I don't know what a metaphor is. So then they say, they just went on. So then it was just like, because the whole Mother Earth tree thing is just so cliche. It's been overdone. You just can't just talk about Mother Earth and the mother tree. And it's just so trite and so cliche. And, they just kept saying, you have to reach for a fresher metaphor, something sparkly, something that will sparkle us. So I listen and I listen, and then I'm just getting really pissed because I don't know what a metaphor is. So I've got some shame going on, right? But I also know what I'm being fucked with, so I know they were disrespecting me. So I listened for a little bit longer, and then finally I just said, you know what? It's not a metaphor. It's a fucking tree. It's a tree. It's a tree I climbed up in, right? And it's about a girl getting molested, and that's about as sparkly as this is going to get, right? So I blew up. They blew up. Everything. I thought I was going to get kicked out of the workshop, but I wasn't at all. And it actually has a really happy ending. But it's a funny story because now as a professor, I teach about metaphor and everything. So I always have to tell my students that story, right? Because metaphors are wonderful, but if you don't know what they are, you don't know what they are. So okay, I'm going to read one more piece, and then I think we're going to jump over to the Q&A and have at it, see what's what. So this is a piece, this is actually the title piece to the book, and it's called Like a Woman. And I won't read the whole thing, but I'm just going to read you the first part of it, because what it does is I want to show you what it's like when the teenager took over the story, right? So I, as author, sat down to write this piece. And then, but the teenage street kid just said, get out of the way, right? Get out of the way. Let me tell the story. So, fortunately, I'm smart enough to know that when a character wants to tell the story, you do get out of the way. All right. You let whatever comes up, you let them have the page. So it's a longer piece, but I'm just going to read you the first paragraph. Because you'll get a sense of what it is when the teenage narrator takes charge. Okay, Like a Woman. The other girls tell me I'm going to have to dress like a woman if I'm going to make it on the streets. Screw you, I laugh. I've been fucked all my life, and I've never had to wear a dress yet. Just trying to help you out, girl, they call out as they walk on down Santa Monica Boulevard, ankles bowed out over wobbly spike heels, popping their gum and adjusting their spaghetti strap bras as if they had something special going on down there. Though none of us, except Lisa, have any tits yet. And even if I had them, I wasn't about to go dressing in no drag shit. For one thing, it costs too much, and I've got better things to do with my money. For another, I can't hardly walk in that shit, much less run or fight. Some girls can, though. I seen one girl whip off those fuck me pumps and bust a motherfucker trying to get something for nothing across the side of his head quicker than I could have cracked his nuts. Said she messed up his eardrum because she got the pointy part right inside his ear hole. And see, check out that blood, girl. I think she was just feeling good because she got his wallet, messed him up, and didn't even break a heel. So that's what happens when Taylor takes over telling the story. So, yeah. Okay. So I think this is a good time to shift into Q&A. I feel like I've been babbling a lot. I'm curious to hear what you have to say, what questions you have.
Okay. So here we are, and we do have lots of questions. So we're gonna go ahead and jump in. And Catherine, do you wanna go ahead and start with a question?
Sure. Excuse me. As there are more, I think there are more questions coming in. So I'm actually going to ask just kind of a starter question, and then we'll go from there. So that's, we have students in the audience who are very likely interested in pursuing social action writing. And you shared a bit about your non-traditional path. I was wondering if you could also maybe just say a little bit about your writing process. How did you first, how has basically your process shifted over all the years of writing?
So my process is not really one that you want to follow. So I did not grow up a writer. I was not somebody that kept a little journal and wrote in it. I'd see other girls do that, and I was like, you think that shit's safe to write in that thing? The little chintzy lock on it, right? So I didn't write until really my 30s, 40s. So and then the way that it started was poems just started coming out in therapy. So I read a lot. And I told stories, but I didn't really start writing. And then what happened was, it started with the poems. And then the more that I wrote and the more that I shared it, like other people started seeing me as a writer. So they saw me as a writer way sooner than I saw myself. But they were people that I respected. And, so now it's interesting because teaching writing, both creative writing and also comp, I do that for my students, right? I can see them as writers far, far sooner than they see themselves. And so anytime you've been given a gift, like I was, about being seen and encouraged to do something, that's beyond what you can imagine for yourself. It's like, you got to do that for others, right? So, and it's cool because now I see some of my students are teaching in the schools and they're doing that with other kids. So it's just affirming everybody and that. In terms of process, everything still kind of stays in my head. I'm not like a draft person. And I just think about it a lot and it stays with me. And again, I don't recommend that. I recommend actually getting it on paper and then thinking about it, getting it on paper, going back to it. I think my practice is still kind of stuck in the days of not feeling like anything was safe out from me. So it's not a practice I recommend, but it does mean that by the time I sit down to write something, it kind of comes out in one whole piece, right? Yeah. So I'll go back and do some editing. But one of the things that I do as a writer is think about there's always something that's kind of bugging me or working me, like right now I'm kind of just haunted by the image of the young Palestinian girl, Mend, who was her whole family was bombed in a car, and she was alive, but she was the only survivor, and she called for help. And they were able to get word out, and 2 ambulance drivers got there, got almost to her, and then they were bombed and killed, and then she was killed. So the image of her and what happened and just the horror, I don't know what I'm going to write, but I know I'm going to write about it, you know. So sometimes when something, it can be an image like that, or it could be just a line in your head or something that you think you need to write about. You just keep working it and put it down, draft it, free write. Don't worry about what it's going to turn out like. Just start stream of consciousness writing, and then you'll get from that, you know, whatever next has to happen. Yeah.
Thank
And
you
I'm
so
going
much
to add
for
one more
sharing
thing too,
that.
which is like
Yeah,
with
yeah.
social action writing, if you're going to write about something like that, then you also have to do your research, right? You have to go back and do your research, and you have to learn more information than will ever go into the piece, but you have to be informed. So sometimes, you know, you think about research like, you know, in your more academic classes, but no, it's like, as a social action writer, you definitely have to do research, because you'll be writing about your own experience, but you will be writing about things that are beyond what you know, and you have to get past the stereotypes or the ignorances that we all have. Right. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. When you were giving that example, it reminded me at the beginning where you talked about how social action writing is often a necessity. And I think thinking of those examples, it shows how that's true in practice.
Yeah, yeah.
I have so many questions for you. But don't worry, I won't ask them all at once. But there is something actually that kind of connects to this, what you were sort of speaking to just now. And you know, historians, we straddle the humanities and the social sciences because we can't commit. That's just us. And this is the sort of social science side. Historians will say things like sources drive the historian. So I'm, you know, as I'm hearing you speak about doing your research and doing your homework as a writer, what sources drive you as a writer? What are the things that drive your writing?
Well, right now, like, I'm just kind of stuck reading. There's a Palestinian poet that I'm reading, Mossab Abu Toa, and like, I'm doing research, scholarly research. You know, I'm reading from different people that I admire, but I'm also just reading his poems, and I'm reading his poems. So Mossab was the poet that he was born in Gaza, came to the US, got his MFA, won all kinds of awards for his books, for his poetry, was living in Gaza with his family. And, you know, when the war started, was told that he could leave, but he started to leave, but then was arrested and tortured and then released. And now he's safe, but he's also witnessing what's happening to friends, family, whatever. So there's a way. So I do the scholarly stuff, right? I do the scholarly stuff, but I always also turn to the poets, because there's a way that poets get to the humanity of it, you know, and it's hard to bear, right? The grief and the pain. But it feels really important that we not just move to an intellectual understanding of things, even though that's very important. So right now, that's what I'm reading. So anything that he references, then I go study more. So any bits, I just take it and then go
There's
off.
something that's so much more multidimensional about that, as like I think that there's that sort of two-dimensional sense of what research is that I think sometimes we mistakenly teach our students too, right? About you go to find the source and you report what the source says, but real research is actually so much more multidimensional, right? Like it's about in really embracing and looking and following kind of different paths and trying to understand from a different perspective and a different lens. And so I really love you sort of speaking to looking at that poet's work and how you're looking at that poet's work and how it's inspiring you.
Yeah. The story, you know, to me, the stories are what's important, you know. I mean, you got to have the facts, you got to have the dates, you got to have all of that, but it's the stories that keep us connected to the humanity.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have a great audience question that I would love to ask. It says, when you write a piece like the bleed through piece, how do you feel afterward? Are you more deeply in the grief and pain, or does it help you come out of it?
Yes and yes, all of it, all of it. You know, this usually when I write, like a lot of the pieces that go into like a woman, for example, you know, there are things I've thought about, I've felt, I've processed, I've done therapy with, and then I've written, and it does feel good to write it. And it's terrifying, right? You know, it's like they say, there's nothing to writing. All you do is open up a vein, right? It's like, it's scary as shit. You know, it is super scary. And then there's the second part, which is actually showing it to someone else, right? Which can be even more terrifying. So it's one thing to journal, to get it out, which is super important. But then it's another to take that risk and you know, just have the faith that it will be received in some way, right? So you share it with somebody that you trust. So it can feel good. I think it's always feels good to speak truth, you know. And then the second part, which is kind of scary, is when it goes out to somebody else. So a couple of things. One is like sometimes the pieces that I read from, like when I went on book tour with Like a Woman, you know, these are pieces that I've written, I've done therapy around, I've, you know, proofread, I've edited. I mean, I've read them. But sometimes what happens is when I'm up there and I'm reading it, I almost feel it, hear it for the first time. And so there's been times where I've started to cry, not because of like my personal experience, but just because it's just so sad what this kid went through, right? So it's a weird thing to be impacted by your own poetry as a reader while you're trying to give a reading. But so that happens. The thing with the Tikkun piece, you know, these are things that I've never even barely talked about or processed. But it all came up almost exactly in the form that it is. It just came out like that as a rant, as a just, you know, here's all these things happening. And I shared it with a friend who sent it to the editor of Tikkun. And within days, they wanted to publish it. So I was like, holy shit, this thing is going way too fast. Because then it's like published out there in the world within like, and it was published online. So it went out way faster than I had any time to process. So it's, you know, it's a work in progress. You know, it's a deeply vulnerable piece. It's a deeply personal piece. It, you know, it deals with trauma that I have not yet processed. So, you know, it's a lot, but I felt like it needed to be said, you know. It's like I felt like it needed to be said. And you know, I always think about like what Audre Lorde said, right? She said, the work is more important than the fear. So it's like whatever fear I have or whatever anxiety, it's kind of my personality, it's my ego, it's those fears. I don't want to discount those, but the work is more important, you know. So
Can I ask, how do you care for yourself then? Like, I mean, like, I think this is important for especially for our students to hear this too, is like, where do you find sites of care?
yeah, well, you know, surprisingly enough, a lot with animals, a lot with oceans, a lot with trees. But I am getting really good with the two-leggeds too. So I have, you know, I feel like I've spent my whole life like trying to reconcile my humanity, and I'm still working on it. But I have really dear friends. I have really, you know, good people around me, good colleagues, good friends, and finding other writers that you trust, right? Because just taking a piece like that and bringing it into a workshop setting, I wouldn't recommend, right? Because it's a little too risky. But sharing it with friends, with people that get you, that will affirm you. And there's different kind of feedback. Like sometimes you just want the feedback of like, wow, I see you, I see you. I'm sorry that happened to you. Are you okay? Right? It's like that kind of feedback. I care about you, the content. And then sometimes you want feedback about the piece, right? About the craft, about the this, right? So be strategic about who you have in your life and who you share your stuff with, because that contributes a lot to self-care. And we throw in a little wannabe meditation practice and this and that, and I'm not very good at it, but I try. And yeah.
Okay, so okay, now I'm trying to think about like where to go next. So one of the things I'm really curious about, and I think this is something that you've kind of been speaking to, and it really comes up both in, I think, in the novel and in the poem that you shared with us, is that you write a lot about grief, abuse, and trauma in like very physical ways, but you also write about collective trauma and abuse that come from us all existing in a racist, sexist, homophobic society. Do you see parallels in the impact of these kinds of traumas and in how they're presented in your work?
Yeah, and I think it's just how it makes sense to me theoretically and conceptually and as a practice, but it also makes sense just in my body, how I take things in, how my spirit takes things in. They're all linked, right? They're all linked. And so it's like I can't. Well, there's also, as a little different, kind of ties into the self-care thing. There's this practice called Tonglen, Tonglen, which is where you normally they say like, breathe in the good things and breathe out the bad things, right? This is the opposite. It's like you breathe in whatever your suffering is. So if it's grief, if it's physical pain, if it's whatever, you breathe that in, and then you breathe out relief and ease out into the world. And then you start with what's happening for yourself, and then you take it to people that are having grief. You breathe in their grief, and then you breathe out relief and wishes for joy and ease and equanimity for them. And then you take it larger to the societal and the world grief, and you breathe that in and you breathe it out. And what that does for me is, it's kind of counterintuitive, I guess, but it makes me feel so not alone, and it makes me feel connected with others, right? And so it's not like saying like, well, why am I so hurt about this? Other people are suffering worse. It's not that. It's more like it's all part of the same fabric, right? It's all part of the same fabric, and the ways that we are wounded, and we are also wounding others, right? So that gets into like kind of anti-racist work, that gets into other things. It's like not just the ways that I have been harmed by, homophobia, for example, or gay bashing, or the ways that I have been harmed as a woman around rape or abuse, right? But it's also other sections, other aspects of my identity, right? The ways that I inhabit the world as cisgendered, white, able-bodied person, right? And how does that, what is my role and responsibility in those kind of sufferings, right? And injustices, sufferings that I didn't cause them, but it's all on us to do something, right? It's like, because it's all the same. It's all the same suffering. And so and you can kind of see that like in the bleeding piece, right? It's like it's all blended in. So it's as concrete as, one form of blood or another form of blood, and one form of violence and another, and survival. So Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
I also am now trying to figure out where we should go. We have a lot of different questions. So I think I might ask a little bit more about teaching. I know you talked about that more toward the beginning, but one of the things that you mentioned was how first generation college students they sometimes feel like they have to become college students, whatever that means, and
Right.
and kind of leave themselves behind or their home identities behind. And so I would just like to hear your advice for students who are maybe hesitant to break silence. How do you encourage them to feel comfortable and realize maybe they don't have to be the stereotypical college student, whatever that is?
Mhm. Well, again, it's like find a safe space to do it first. And if you're in a classroom, you got to suss out if it's safe, right? Because there's so many weird things that we all do as professors, right? It's like, if you're the only Black student in a class, you're expected to speak up for all Black people, or it's like that is not going to be a place that you want to share your own personal experience in, right? It's just like, so, I remember one, I teach at Cal State Monterey Bay, which has like a ridiculously low number of African-American students. And so a lot of students would find themselves being the only Black person in a class, right? So one day, first day of class, I'm in this writing class, and there's like 8 Black students in there. And I was like, whoa, did we just like really get our shit together around enrollment or something? And it's like, no, it turns out they all like planned together what classes they were going to take, and they took them in bulk. So they were like, so they would have each other's back, right? So then you've got like, 8 students is enough of a critical mass in a small class of like 20, 26 students that nobody's responsible for representing the Black identity or something, right? And so and then they can have each other's backs, because there will be some stupid shit that people say, it's just true. So in the creative writing class, it's tricky because you're encouraged to talk about where you come from. You're encouraged to bring that in, and it sometimes will be misread, right? So again, I think it's important to hopefully you've got like a professor that can kind of have their stuff somewhat together, or be humble about what they don't. But also, if you've got a good person in the class with you that will have your back, and you have their back, right? So like an example of that is, I used to teach a environmental creative writing class. And so students wrote about all the aspects of the environment, right? And where they came from. And, this one student, he was writing, so I'll tell 2 stories. This one student was writing about his dad. Like that was the point of the story, was something about his relationship with his dad. And there's a part where he's trying to get home early enough that he can do something with his dad. So that's the story. But he gets stopped by the police, right? And so this is a story that takes place in East Salinas, which is predominantly Latinx town. And so that's just a piece in the story. And he's rousted by the cops, but he gets out, but he's late to do what he needs to do with his dad. So that's the story. So he's workshopping it in class. And another student who's, this writer who's claims, has definitely owned himself as a writer. A young white guy is talking about, I really liked your story, and I thought you did a good character description on your dad, but the whole thing with the cops, that's just not believable. That's not realistic. So it's like, yeah, in your world it's not realistic, but he's saying it with the authority of someone who's published, right, who's done that, and he's giving this feedback, like, yeah, you did good character description, you did this, but that section, that's really not realistic. Well, of course we had to break it down, and and unfortunately there's a lot of educating of folks that has to go on. And, you know, I have had students say, why do I have to pay my tuition and educate somebody? Right. You know, so it can be frustrating, but, you know, after a while, everybody does learn. And, you know, in that class, unfortunately, it kind of veered off with other white students talking about, you know, their experience with cops. And, you know, that was very different, right? It was like, you know, yeah, there was this time that, you know, we stole the golf carts at Pebble Beach and we were driving at midnight and the sheriffs came and yeah, they were like kind of jerks. And, you know, and then the sheriff took me home and embarrassed me in front of my dad. And I'm like, you just like stole something and the sheriff took you home to your father, right? So just the level of the disconnect of privilege and what somebody as a young teenager goes through in relationship with police, for example, right? So sometimes stories just collide and you have to sort out the mess, you know, but everybody did learn. And after, you know, I had to stop it because then there was just a whole slew of like criming while white stories. And it's like, okay, we get it, you know, we get it. And so clearly the learning that has to happen is for white folks in the class to learn that their experience is not universal, right? I had another experience where, you know, a young white boy from Central Valley, I think around Merced, was writing about his experience with his dad. And there he was writing about a scene of driving around in his dad's truck. And his dad, they had moved from Texas or something and bought this ranch and or farm, and they employed a lot of migrant workers. And so he's talking about driving around, I guess it was Fresno. They're driving around Fresno and with his dad, and his dad makes a comment. And this is in a story that he's reading, right? His dad makes a comment. You know, they drive past a group of like Mexican men have gotten off work and they're standing on a corner in a residential thing, drinking beer and talking, right? So the dad makes this super racist statement and says like, yeah, you know, that's why we don't pay them because they just drink it, right? So that's in his story, right? So he's reading that story and he's just using dialogue, right? I'm writing a story about my dad in the truck and some dialogue. But also in the class are 3 young women, Latina, who actually are from that same area. Their families didn't work on that particular farm, but they worked on surrounding agricultural farms. So you can just see how they're going to feel having somebody write that. So obviously they started, you know, it got into a free-for-all, and it was you know, people were hurt, you know, and they were sharing that it's hurtful to hear that. And so we worked through it. And one of the things that I noticed as a teacher is like your tendency is to, when somebody does something like that, is to shut it down, right? Shut this down. It's uncomfortable. It's hurting other people. But is that actually going to serve the student or anybody, right? So I wound up telling him that as a writer, you have to do research. Getting back to what Kyle was saying, you have to do research, and you have to, if you're setting your story in Fresno and in the surrounding agricultural fields, you have to know about those fields and you have to know about the people that work in them. So that was his next assignment, right? So he had to learn more about what he did not know. And then the other thing that I asked of him was for him to go deeper into his own father's history, right? So surprisingly enough, it comes out, dad was a full-on alcoholic, just got out of private rehab, right? So like, who gets to go to a Betty Ford clinic in private to deal with their alcoholism? And who gets, you know, thrashed for drinking a beer on the street in a public space, right? So it all, you know, it all wound up. But all that to say is that sharing your stuff in a creative writing class or bringing who you are into a college experience is not just going to be safe and easy. It is going to be met up with other versions of reality and discounting and So the more that you can have folks that have your back and have other students, like I think it's so important for students to pair up and go to classes together, and and or bond with who is going to have your back, and then you also have to promise to have their back, right? So that nobody has to bear it alone. So
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing those stories with us and kind of the
Yeah.
overarching advice. That was phenomenal. Thank you.
Yeah. Um, I think we're kind of getting to the point where we're almost at the last question. And I feel like, well, so there's so much that I want to ask, but I really want to know, what are the next stories you're going to tell? So where are you going next with your path as a writer?
So I'm currently writing some teaching stories, some especially teaching while queer stories, which are kind of interesting. And then I've been writing, I don't know what to call them. There is like a collection of healing stories, like a chronicle of healing. Because I'm trying to look at, like, what is it in the human spirit that causes us, in the face of so much brutality, like, to be like that little blade of grass coming up through concrete, right? Like, what is it that in the human spirit that tries to reach up for the light? And where have been those moments of healing? Like, for me personally, but for anybody, just those little moments of grace. Because some of it is like, yeah, therapy, but some of it is also just somebody responding to you in a kind way, right? Or so yeah. And I think, we'll see how that turns out. But it's an interesting question for me. And so a lot of times writers, like, I don't have any answers, right? It's like, but you write into the question, right? And it's haunted me. It's like, what is it that when there's violence done to somebody, like, what makes a difference between whether you then take in that violence and then replicate it and perpetuate abuse out into the world, right? Because we know that most people that are violent have had violence done to them. So what is it that can cause somebody to flip it out and do harm, and what causes somebody to flip it inward and do harm to yourself? And what causes somebody to want to break the cycles of violence? So I don't have any answers. If anybody does, hit me up. Send them to me.
Yeah, actually, if anyone does in general help all of us, that would be great. Please put it in the Q&A section. Um, I um I will say that I'm on sabbatical in the fall, and I will be doing a lot of writing, and I'm going to ask while we're on recording if I can come write with you.
Oh,
I'll
that'd be awesome. I would love that.
do writing dates then.
Love that.
Um, so yeah, I mean, I think that I think that I love that you're writing through your path there, finding your path there. I love that. Okay. Catherine, do you want to close this out?
Uh,
We do have a little treat before Catherine closes us out. We had a request in the Q&A for some appreciation. So we've opened up the chat to our attendees to share appreciations for our speakers. It's something we haven't done really before. So if people can want to share their appreciations, they can use the actual chat to do so, and share any appreciations they have for Deb.
Oh.
So go ahead and use the chat. There we go. Oh, right there. Jumping right in. Share for a really exceptional talk. And while people are doing that, Catherine, do you want to make our plug for our next?
Yes, I just wanted to quickly make an announcement about our next event for this semester. I'm going to share the flyer. This will actually be an on-campus event on the Fremont campus. We'll be having a roundtable discussion of women in politics in honor of Women's History Month on March 13th. This will be at 11 a.m. in the Jackson Theater on the Fremont campus. So please mark your calendars. We hope many of you will be able to attend.
Okay, well, I want to, on behalf of the Lytton Center and my co-director, Catherine. I want to thank you, Deb, for joining us today. I am just really blown away by everything that you presented today, and by your talent, but also just by your soul and your energy and what you're doing and what you do with your work, and by everything that you shared with us. This is a really impactful talk, and I'm really looking forward to using this in my courses. So I'm glad it's recorded. So really phenomenal. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. And we look forward to having you at our next event.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Okay.